Today, the latest weapons, coupled with the fighting skill of the American soldier, stand ready, on the alert all over the world to defend this country, you, the American people, against aggression. This is The Big Picture, an official television report to the nation from the United States Army. Now, to show you part of the big picture, here is Sergeant Stuart Queen.
If you had somehow slept through the last decade and a half, you would never have known about the proud men of the 24th Infantry Division. For this division was created for our own troubled times. But in its brief history, it has written an heroic record which assures it a place of glory in the military annals of this nation. The 24th Division was formed out of the old Hawaiian Division shortly before Pearl Harbor. And it fought bravely in many of the decisive battles in the Southwest Pacific that followed. With victory, it went on occupation duty in Japan. When war came again, the men of the 24th were the first Americans to reach the bitter and tragic soil of Korea. This is the story of their magnificent performance there.
On a hilltop 30 miles south of Seoul, overlooking the ancient valley town of Osan, Korea, a monument to the recent past is dedicated. The long and bitter struggle in Korea is a page of history now, but one whose importance and meaning will endure forever. And this monument commemorates the first American soldiers to begin to write it, men of the 24th Infantry Division. A grateful nation whose land was plundered and whose life was threatened by the menace of communist aggression remembers these men. And a proud nation who bore these men and trained them, it remembers too and salutes them. They were the first. They fought bravely and long. This is the story of the war they fought. In June of 1950, the 24th Division was engaged in the occupation of Japan, as it had been for 4 years. Ever since the end of World War II, the men of the 24th had worked to help Japan rebuild itself. It was a productive and fruitful period. A war was past, perhaps all wars, and this was a time for peaceful pursuits. But hope for peace was already dying as 1950's summer bloomed. North of the 38th parallel in Korea, communism was readying its timetable for aggression, and a massive array of men and weapons stood poised to strike. On the 25th of June, the well-equipped North Korean army struck in force, pushed across the border, overran the South Korean defenses, and plunged the nation into war. The United Nations met promptly to counter this violation of the peace. The free nations condemned the North Korean aggression, and the decision was made to halt the invader by force. As the invader continued his sweep south despite American air and naval action, it became obvious that ground troops would be needed, and the 24th Division was alerted. First to go was a task force of 540 men and their weapons. While the rest of the division got ready to leave, these men were flown to South Korea on July 1st, the vanguard of what would later become a mighty United Nations force. Their orders were simply this: move north, stop them where you find them. So they started north. They moved through villages whose people stood in numb terror. And ahead they walked through towns that were ghostly still, whose people had fled in the wake of the approaching invader. And finally at Osan, with the enemy only a few hours ahead and coming fast, they made their stand. On the hill where the monument to their courage stands now, they set up their guns and they waited. They were few, and they could not win a war by themselves. But when the enemy came, they could try to delay him. For 2 days on the high ground and the low, they held the enemy back. 2 precious days. The cost was high, very high. But the time bought in blood and courage by that tiny band of warriors permitted the rest of the 24th Division to load up at Japan and get over to Korea while there still was a South Korea. For the 24th, the peaceful days of the occupation were over now. Everything it had, every man, every weapon, every vehicle had a new job. The division's regiments and battalions loaded at record speed from 5 ports along the coast of Kyushu. For the entire 24th Division, these first days of the war, the story of Osan was repeated and repeated again. Facing a powerfully equipped enemy, their mission was to fight for time until more help could come and then withdraw. On July 12th, they drew back to the Kum River line and dug in there to defend the city of Taejun. Major General Dean, the 24th Division's courageous commander, and Lieutenant General Walker, commanding general of the 8th Army, together planned the delaying strategy of this battle, one of the most bitter of the war. They were still fighting alone, and they put everything they had into it and bought a few more days of crucial time. And finally, they withdrew again, destroying their bridges behind them. Help was on the way. The 25th Infantry Division had landed at Busan and was pushing north. On the east coast, the 1st Cavalry Division landed at Pohangdong, but it was still the 24th Division's war at Taejun. They held every hill dominating the city as long as they could and fought in the valleys leading to it. And finally, they withdrew to the city itself, Taejun, a name that will live in the record of the 24th Division as long as the division itself shall live. There were no rookies left now. They were all pros, those who remained. And for 2 days straight out of hell, with ammunition running low and red artillery making an inferno of the city, they fought in the streets of Taejun. General Dean was everywhere in those raging streets, giving heart to his tired men, fighting beside them. He was taken prisoner after this battle, and it would be a long time before his division saw him again. On July 21st, the 24th Division pulled out of Taejong. They had fought the last of their lonely, delaying actions. They had fought for time and won, but it was not a victory to rejoice. The city they left behind them lay in smoking ruin, and now the world could begin to see in full measure how war would scar the face of this ancient land. They withdrew. These were familiar words now, words that could sap a fighting spirit. But they could hope now that this would be the last withdrawal. The Naptung River runs generally south along the Korean peninsula. Wide and deep, it has served many purposes in Korean history, but none more important than its use as a natural defense of the port city of Pusan. A section of this river was to be the western boundary of the 8th Army's final defense around the Pusan perimeter in the summer of 1950. The 24th Division moved back to this river and dug in. For the first time in the war, they had a position they could really defend. For the ground troops, this was a period of defense and the tightening of lines. But Allied planes took over the job of offense, carrying the war to the enemy's own positions. During the first weeks of August, the perimeter line was assaulted again and again by the enemy, who had boasted he would push the UN forces into the sea. But the line held. At Yongsan, at Changyong, at Masan in the 24th Division sector, units of the 24th repelled constant enemy attacks, while behind them, the port of Pusan filled with the troops and equipment and weapons which would turn the tide of war. By the middle of August, the line was secure. By the 25th of August, men of the 24th Division had been in combat for 55 consecutive days. Now, relieved for a while by the newly arrived 2nd Division, they rested. These were the rewards of their battle, and they were very great ones, the simple luxuries of life itself. For a short but wonderful period, they were able to relax, to catch up with the world whose news they themselves were making, and to fortify themselves for whatever lay ahead. On the 16th of September, a new phase of the war began with an Allied assault on Incheon, on the west coast of Korea, in the heart of the enemy's territory. General MacArthur, commander of the United Nations forces, himself directed the invasion of this port by the U.S. 10th Corps. Troops of the 1st Marine and 7th Infantry Divisions stormed ashore and rushed forward toward the capital city of Seoul. Simultaneously with the 10th Corps' invasion of Incheon, the 24th Division, along with the other Allied forces around the Pusan defense line, opened up on the Communists with everything they had and broke out of their perimeter. Enemy resistance was heavy, and it left its mark. But by now, the United Nations force had built into a strong and well-equipped 8th Army. This was the moment of victory it had waited for and suffered for, and it was not to be deterred. The 24th Division moved forward with new confidence. Units of the 24th, doing what they had kept the enemy from doing for so long, crossed the Naktung River every way they could on September 19th. They pushed north along the same routes they had traveled before, going the other way, past familiar landmarks. Taejun, the most familiar of them all. For the men of the 24th, there was a special kind of victory in this return to the city of their most heartbreaking defeat. The long road back was paved with victory, but it was also scarred with memories. The road back was arduous because the troops had to rebuild it, repair the bridges and the roads they had destroyed in their withdrawal, and those the enemy had destroyed in his retreat. But painstaking though it was a job that had to be done, and it was done, and the Army moved ahead. By the middle of October, the 24th Division was crossing the 38th parallel, having helped clear the area north of Seoul. By the latter part of November 1950, the division had pushed along the entire west coast of North Korea. Elements of the 24th had come to within a scant 17 miles of the Yalu River, the northernmost boundary of Korea, separating it from Red China's Manchuria. The men of the 24th Division ate Thanksgiving dinner in the snows of the North Korean mountains that year, but it was a great Thanksgiving. Victory lay just within grasp, and the hope for a Christmas at peace was more real than the biting cold of the enemy's land. But across the Yalu, in the vastness of Manchuria, lay poised a new enemy, two powerfully equipped field armies of Communist China. In late November, the new enemy struck with the full force of its might, and a new battle was joined. The force behind the assault of this new enemy was too strong. He had too many men, too much fire, and the United Nations command was forced back. Thus, this new war began as the last one had, in agonizing withdrawal. The hope for Christmas peace died bitterly in the hearts of weary men. The 24th Division left behind it a scorched earth in its withdrawal. If you can't take it with you, the motto went, burn it. The roads south were clogged with refugees, homeless people, uprooted from their villages and driven into the winter cold by the terrifying threat of a communist occupation. Finally, below Seoul, the 24th Division took a determined stand, only a few miles from the spot where the first troops of the 24th had met the enemy 6 months before. Here they would resist, and they would hold against the full might of the Chinese Communist forces. January 1951, the tide turned once more, and the 8th Army began moving forward again, slowly this time and painfully, fighting hard for every mile of ground against powerful communist resistance. Sometimes for the 24th Division, it was a matter of inching forward to regain lost and vital territory. By mid-March, United Nations troops were able to re-enter Seoul, the beleaguered capital city of this ravaged nation. After that, they pushed again north of the 38th parallel and were back in enemy land once more. In July of 1951, while the 8th Army held positions which could not be penetrated, the enemy took up a Russian proposal to meet with the United Nations forces to arrange a ceasefire. Little more than a year after the war began, the opposing sides met, first at Kaesong, and later at Panmunjom. The attention of the entire world was focused on this remote stretch of Korean land, marked as a neutral area in the midst of war by balloons that flew above it for almost 2 years. Through that hot, dry summer that the peace talks began, the war was a limited one, marked mainly by patrols and airstrikes. Near the end of August, the 24th Division moved into reserve, and for a month, life was one of relaxation. October of that year brought the division its last big battle of the war, an offensive action launched to take strategic high positions away from the enemy. Less than 3 months later, the 24th Division moved to Japan, where it took over the security guard of that nation and underwent rugged training for 1.5 years. The 24th Division returned to Korea shortly before General Clark, the United Nations commander, in July 1953, signed the truce with the communists, ending the war, which had lasted 3 long, bitter years. With peace came Operation Big Switch, the exchange of prisoners both sides had lost. Out of the enemy's prison camps in the north came many of the 24th Division's old warriors, veterans of its roughest days, evoking memories of heroic names: Osan, Taejun, Pyongyang, Cheongju. And there was none whose return evoked stronger memories than General Dean, the 24th's commander, who had been captured at Taejun. The 24th Division was charged with the mission of sending back to communist land some of the hardcore defiant Red prisoners the United Nations forces had captured. It had yet another job, however, and a better one. In January and February of 1954, one regiment of the 24th Division took charge of the Chinese ex-prisoners of war who elected to forsake communism and return to freedom. In this last task, connected directly with the Korean action, the men of the 24th watched this phase of the war they had been involved in from the first end nobly. the proud colors of the 24th Infantry Division marched in Korea for the last time in November 1954. The men who had been the first to stand, to fight, and to fall in this first war to contain communist aggression staged a final parade over land they had fought for before returning once more to the Japan they had left. It was a solemn goodbye to a nation whose fate had been bound up with its own in days of deep trouble, and in a sense, is bound to it still. For the heroic record of the 24th Division at midpoint in the 20th century, when free men acted on their knowledge that strength and courage are the only deterrents to aggression, is written indelibly over the face of the ancient land of Korea.
The 24th Division today is in training. If it should be called on again, there is no doubt that its performance would match that of its magnificent past. Now, this is Sergeant Stuart Queen, inviting you to be with us again next week for another look at the United States Army in action on The Big Picture.
The Big Picture is a weekly television report to the nation on the activities of the Army at home and overseas. Produced by the Signal Corps Pictorial Center. Presented by the U.S. Army in cooperation with this station. You can be an important part of the big picture. You can proudly serve with the best equipped, the best trained, the best fighting team in the world today, the United States Army.